to talk to you about what good compost can do on the ground. And I have been really fortunate to work with a phenomenal group of people up north in Marin called the Marin Carbon Project. How many people here have heard of the group? Great. How many of you saw John Wick present last year? Okay, cool. So I've seen John's presentation probably 36 times. I still learn from it, so I hope you guys still learn today. I guess I'll say why I think this is a key leverage point for climate change. Compost does something that's really incredible from a climate perspective. It takes emissions that are happening upstream from the high powerful potent gas that is methane, which I think we're undercounting by amortizing it to the lifetime of carbon, instead of going after what it really does in the short term, which is a high value greenhouse gas emission. And then downstream, it does this amazing thing where it can sequester carbon. I'm going to talk to you more about that today when it's on the soil. And then also, as a third thing, it creates resilience within the systems where it's used. So it's mitigation, sequestration, and adaptation, which is a pretty phenomenal thing to find in our world, where you can get one thing that does three things to deal with the biggest challenge of our era. So this is a quick picture I'm going to show you. I like to show this first because I'm going to talk to you about some science, but really the cows know best. So these are the 5 control plots that were part of a large experiment that we did up in Marin and in the Sierra foothills. So this experiment looked at if grazing management or compost additions were causing carbon sequestration. What we found was really interesting, but the cows already knew about it, which is that the grass that was grown from those composted plots, first of all, forage production increased about 50 to 70%, so there's more grass. That grass had a higher protein content, and the ground was softer because it held more water. So the cows self-selected these plots, in addition to what the scientists had to tell us. So what the experiment was, about a ½ inch of compost, so really about a dusting, was put down on Marin rangelands and up again in the Sierra foothills. So a one-time application of compost caused a system change. Well, what did it change in the system? Well, what we found was that in the first year, there actually was no measurable change, but the control plot that did not receive carbon lost carbon. Even the land that was grazed really well was losing carbon. The land that had compost applied the first year didn't lose carbon, and it didn't gain carbon. But the next year, we saw a net gain of 1 ton of carbon. And the next year, a net gain of 1 ton of carbon. And the next year, we actually have 7 years of data now showing ongoing accumulation of carbon in this soil system from a one-time addition of compost. That's a game changer. We just changed the system from losing to being a sink. So this is what I talked about earlier. It's what the cows already knew. We saw increased forage production of 50, 70%. You go out to any ranchers today, this is what they care about. They might be voting for Trump, but they are really interested in putting compost down on their land. And this is a little bit of the new science. So everyone's like, well, don't we know about photosynthesis? How is this new? Well, what we didn't understand was that that carbon that came into the system, it didn't just cycle in the labile pool, which is the fast-moving pool of carbon. We assumed before that photosynthetic carbon coming in from the plants cycled quickly from the soil back into the atmosphere through soil respiration. What this project helped us show was actually that carbon, that photosynthetic carbon, moved quickly into what we call more stable forms of carbon. So there's different forms of carbon in the soil, and these forms of carbon, they're listed up here as the occluded light fraction and the heavy fraction. They store carbon for a decade or up to a millennia. So that's carbon that's in the ground, it's fixed, and it's staying in the ground, unless you plow it or you overgraze it to the point of erosion. That's new, right? Because we thought before it was just cycling through. But what that tells us is that the rangelands and potentially much agricultural land across the world has a potential to be a sink, i.e. to remove some of this carbon that we have in the atmosphere and actually store it underground. All of this analysis can be found in a set of papers if anyone is interested in talking to me afterward. We have 9 peer-reviewed published papers, which I can share. This is something that I think is really beautiful. I kind of want to paint it, but it's a model simulation. And this model is out of Colorado State University. It's called the Century Model. It's what the IPCC and the federal EPA use when they look at terrestrial carbon sinks. And essentially it says, if you do this thing, what happens afterwards? Well, up here on the left, this is a table that's showing us carbon. And that solid line that starts up high and goes down low, that's the carbon from the compost that was added to the soil. Something we found out was that carbon didn't just oxidize quickly, it actually stayed in the soil a lot longer than we thought it would. The other thing that happens, and it's kind of this beautiful symphonic response, is that's the soil carbon that happens from photosynthesis. From that one-time application, you see this beautiful long-term response, and that timeline goes out 100 years. So models that the whole world uses and thinks are the best predict that that one-time application of compost could have 100 years worth of carbon benefit. So here's the upstream. We've talked a little about methane today, so I won't stay on it, but it's a very potent greenhouse gas and something that the governor recognizes needs to be dealt with his short-lived climate pollutant plan. Compost is key. I was working for John Wick for about a month, and I said, I think your tagline just needs to be, we need more compost. But again, we need quality compost. And so how are we working to get more of that? Well, we're creating market stimulation through education. There's an approved carbon credit protocol through the American Carbon Registry and the CAPCOA, which is the Association of Air Districts. We have the California Healthy Soils Initiative, which many folks in the Marin Carbon Project and the Carbon Cycle Institute worked for years to get that funding in there. We're happy to see it moving forward. We're working with NRCS on an interim practice standard so that compost will qualify for conservation funding, which is Farm Bill funding from the feds. We are supporting state agencies and requesting funding from the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, so a lot of support for CalRecycle and for CDFA and getting this funding for new facilities. And then we're trying to develop new markets with point-of-sale value-add products. And by that, I don't mean new markets for compost. I actually think the California market's pretty robust if it's connected right. What we're talking about is utilizing funding from brands who are interested in climate beneficial products to actually help the farmer buy the compost or set up the composting on site. And folks like Patagonia, Pendleton, Levi have all participated in projects where they've come in and they've paid the farmer to set up the compost pile or to help get the materials on site and create compost so they can get it on their land. So by generating support for those companies who are willing to pay more for a product that comes from land that was managed in this way, we're also working to support the market for compost, because a lot of these growers and ranchers are competing with buyers in the almond and vineyard industry who are willing to and able to pay much more for the compost than someone who's farming cattle or sheep can. And then we're really working on identifying new feedstocks for composting, and I think that it came up earlier. Bill's presentation was talking about on-farm composting. We'd love to see dairies be able to borrow woody biomass from their neighboring orchards so we can combine and get good ag. I'd love to see the composting community, which has been so focused on municipal waste reduction, which we need to continue to focus on, also look at where we can partner with farmers. Is it restaurant? Is it farm to table to farm again? I think that's a fantastic idea. You'd probably have to deal with truck permitting if you don't want to be regulated as a hauler. But I think that there's those questions that we can begin to answer now that we're looking at a whole system. If you're interested in any of that, let me know. I work with a broad range of folks who are focused in this area. So what can you do in 2016? People often ask me what you can do. Well, you guys seem to be doing a lot in San Diego, which is phenomenal. And I encourage you to keep working with the groups you have here. I think one thing that we're working on in the legislature this year is getting champions for the CalRecycle funding. So if you guys have good relationships with your elected officials in the House or the State Senate, we really need support from elected officials for CalRecycle to get that funding so we can get it and get new facilities built down south, which, as we all know, we really need new facilities in Southern California. You guys are in Southern California. Please let your representative know that you care about this. It actually really does matter. Make composting mandatory in your community. It's a complicated thing. We've seen it work really well in places like San Francisco. It's going to be interesting to watch LA roll out its franchise system. If you're able to structure it correctly, mandatory across the board, residential and commercial can be a great strategy. And then the other thing is talk to your local resource conservation district. If you are working with farmers about composting, these guys are really the ones who are spearheading the carbon farming work, where they're looking at compost and 34 other practices that increase soil carbon. We really are trying to focus people into them to reconnect the food and the ag, since they're really managing on the ag side. And the last thing is to share the story. People often ask what the Marin Carbon Project is. It's not a 501c3. It's not a LLC. What it is a group of people that got together and met every month for a couple of years and did some amazing work. And these are some of the people at the tables: University of California Ag Extension Program, UC Berkeley, the Marin Resource Conservation District, the Marin Agricultural Land Trust, Marin Organics, the Natural Resource Conservation Service, and the Carbon Cycle Institute, as well as a couple of private landholders. So they all got together and figured out what they needed to do in their community. And I would encourage you guys to look at similar models. I think you have one right here in your Food Systems Alliance. but regular coordinated meetings with this small group of folks has led to something pretty incredible, which is what I wanted to point out to my favorite quote from Margaret Mead, which is, "Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it is the only thing that ever has."